So this morning we'll have the presentation of Professor Patrick McConney, our dear colleague from Barbados. Patrick is a senior lecturer in West Indies University in Barbados. We're going to share the profiles. You're going to have more opportunity to learn from him and interact with him throughout this week. But he's a dear colleague and very, very much, I'd say, motivational for experience in the field and involving communities and listening to people on the ground. So we invite him to talk about this participatory action research and community-based monitoring with SocMon, who he will talk about what is SocMon for you. So thank you so much for being here, Patrick.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Elisa. I'm just feeling so mellow now. I'm going to try not to get you too excited. But this is an exciting topic, particularly for some of us who've been in this space for quite a while. I'm told that you should find the presentation as well as some exercises that are optional in your folder that you have access to, because in case, like me, you are vision impaired, that may help, particularly those at the back. I'm accustomed to walk around when I do lectures, but they tell me I need to behave in my space. So I will do that very compliantly. So I'm going to give you a little tour. It's going to look something like that. We're going to talk a little bit about setting things up. Then we're going to talk about the main topics of this presentation. And the good thing is that a lot of you have already covered this, both in your academic careers and also in the previous presentations from colleagues. You're going to see the usual terms we talk about, and some of them that are coming up a little bit later. And then we're going to wrap up. There are activities we can do depending on how much fun you're having or not, or we can just talk about it some more. Yeah? So you can look through that. So a little bit of a preamble, and preambles are good because they help to set the scene. We're going to use these PAR terms, participatory action research, PAR terms, quite a lot. I speak in acronyms also. So I presume most of the acronyms, we talk about SPSAS and CAS, as Fikret did yesterday. I'm presuming that they're familiar to you. So one of the first things I do normally is to set a bit of a social contract with participants in anything. So, and because we're doing PAR, we're talking about co-developing, co-learning, co-creating. So you have power. We're going to come to power a little bit later too. But what I want you to achieve out of this, but also your discussions, the ones you've had previously and the ones you're going to have for the remainder of the course, is that to understand how PAR and community-based management, call it CBM, and socioeconomic monitoring, SocMon, relate to transdisciplinarity. Not only interdisciplinarity, which I'm sure we're all well embedded in, but also transdisciplinarity. A little bit different, as was explained before. And of course, we're going to look at some of the main principles involved behind this. And at the end of it, and maybe reflected in your proposals for the course, you're going to show how these things have come together so that you have more insight, and maybe in the field, be able to engage more and have different outcomes. Now, between Sunday and yesterday, I had some assumptions about you. You need to maybe determine whether these are valid or not. You did that wonderful exercise that Chris did, in the internal thinking. So you presumably already have your PAR foundational concepts. And of course, being academics, for every concept or term, there's a dozen others. Yeah? even without thinking about language, we talk the same thing in different ways all the time, for reasons that perplex me. More interested in underlying design. So, like I said, we're going to do a presentation, an interaction that can cover several months or years of your academic career. So it will only be the tip of the iceberg. And I'm presuming most of you already can read manuals and all the rest of it and get the how-do, so we're going to think about what's behind it. And to be able to adapt the information to your own circumstances. Now, I'm a wet and salty guy, so maybe I should say a little bit about me, I'm not too sure. None of it, or very little bit, is represented in the readings that you already have. You can take a look at them. And in thinking about PAR, I'm a wet and salty guy, so I deal largely with small-scale fisheries at some point, but in the beginning, a long time ago, I was a marine biochemist, absolutely avoiding people, in the lab, doing experiments and looking at things at a molecular level. And then I had a brush, uncomfortable and scary, with neoclassical economics, which turned me over to the dark side of anthropology and sociology. So that's how I got to people. And in that journey, as many of you may have, we have a bunch of nested concepts. So up here, we're going to talk about participatory action research, PAR, and it's a kind of woolly, because if you've read some of the references, you'll see that there are a dozen different schools and all kinds of different frameworks for PAR. So we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about many things to many people. And as explained, it maybe is your disciplinary origin, even if you have shed that. We're also going to talk about CBM and SocMon. I'm going to start using those acronyms. And within that, we're going to talk about citizen science and visualization techniques, because part of the journey is to get from the big design principles right down to what you will do under the tree, in the shop, on the beach, in the forest, with some people, all linking it to transdisciplinarity. So, in a place long, long ago, in an academic galaxy far, far away, I was introduced up close and personal to PAR with colleagues through the colleagues in Nicaragua. And 2000, when this was published, a book by IDRC, seems like a heck of a long time ago. But it was an introduction that led to the importance of integrating many of the things that I'd learned before. And you're on a similar journey. You may find this book interesting still, because, as we'll cover later, storytelling is really important. The stories you're thinking about, the stories you're sharing, as some of you did in your table exercises. The slides are full of statements. Statements are a dime a dozen. You can get statements all over the place. But what's important are the stories to illustrate. So let's start with the big picture. Because we're in Brazil, we have to mention some of the origins, and of course, Paulo Freire is one of the stalwarts of how this notion of PAR and many of the concepts came about. We had chambers in different places. We had the international development crowd in the 80s. World Bank got into the act, and so forth and so forth. You can read about all of this. Where we are now is in the glory days of the Sustainable Development Goals. How wed you are to them or not, you may determine that and share that with your colleagues. Chances are, in many of the research proposals you're writing, you had to name drop the SDGs at least at some point in there, you know? Call them by numbers, if you will. But it's important, beyond that exercise, to see how these things link down in terms of scale. Now, scale and levels, again, a bit of academia that maybe you're familiar with, have different interpretations in the literature, yeah? So I'm going to talk about scale, as some people said, you know, whether institutional, juridical, and so forth. Of course, there's always time and space, and then the levels in between. So one of the arguments is that however you want to depict the SDGs, and one of the points that has already been made, Fikret certainly made it yesterday, was the power of art, and how you have images in your mind, whether consciously or not, and the images that other folks have in their mind, which lead to the stories. So if you consider the SDGs, and of course there are thousands of images of the SDGs, to me, one of the important things is the fact that you can scale up and down. So whether, like me, you're dealing with 14 of life before water, and you want to throw in some climate change action there in 13, and a bit of gender, and of course poverty, you can deal with SDG at global level to local level. Indeed, that was one of the points of ditching the Millennium Development Goals and moving towards the SDGs. So it is more than a trivial exercise to make that scaling happen in your own research and connect to communities. Now, in your readings, you're going to find I've taken a bit from Snap et al., a recent paper, dealing with agroecology. I do not do trees and plants. So the main story here is about the process of PAR, and that is simply one example of many papers that you may find useful in your own orientation, the subjects and the places that you deal with. Their case study that they present on agroecology has some simple lessons that would apply universally, and that's what is important. The notion of wicked problems, that has come up, maybe not expressly so far, but I'm presuming many of you know what we're talking about with wicked problems. Wicked problems, you have that high uncertainty, somebody mentioned. You have the problem of not really even defining the problem, because that is an issue, before you even get to determining what the solutions are. So a lot of the time we find ourselves faced with this. One of the ones that I will probably use an example, but I didn't put any pictures because it's a whole PhD, is that of sargassum seaweed in the Caribbean. It's a wicked problem. So most of you will say, what's he talking about, seaweed? Nah, that's not a problem. So we have colleagues from north coast of Brazil. No? What? That's, okay. We have Mexico, East Coast. All right. So the Mexicans maybe know about sargassum, yes? Maybe? Oh, okay, good. So you can talk to some people who know what we're talking about. But yeah, Brazil has a lot, but apparently not with you guys. You're lucky. Okay. But the problem is that there's high uncertainty, many trade-offs, many different values, all kinds of complexity which we talked about, complex adaptive systems. So a lot of what we do in PAR is to determine choice. But it's not the choice of the researcher, it's the choice of the collective. Collective, I say, rather than community, because community itself has so many different types and definitions: local community, community of interest, community of practice. So you need to determine, as we will see, what the stakeholders are. Chris already covered that, not only stakeholder identification, but stakeholder analysis. And be able to negotiate what you are developing. So there are many claims on these slides as to what PAR can do. I'm not going to go through each of them, maybe just pick out some favorites. One of them, if you're looking at transdisciplinarity, is that you're not only looking at knowledge generation. One can say, well, that's interdisciplinary stuff. But you're also dealing with skills and capacity that will presumably serve people well beyond whatever you're researching, well beyond whatever their issue or problem is, whether that is facilitation, cheering, certain methods, advocacy has been mentioned several times. Oh, let me ask now. So I read in some of your profiles that you have some facilitators in the room. Who are the facilitators? Show of hands. Okay, yeah, we got some. Okay. So you want to hear a facilitator joke? So I'll be gentle. This is being recorded. So facilitators really should be certified, trained, and we have all kinds of bags of tricks and things that we use. But very often, even in the literature, you find folks, maybe like me, who will stand up in front of folks and run something. What are they called? What do the facilitators call them? Anyone? I don't know if it's... No? Okay. Facilitators. Similar words. So a felicitator, felicity meaning happy, makes people happy because of how they're conducting stuff. But they may not be trained and certified facilitators. Yes, you're nodding. Yes, you agree. Yeah. So that is really important in terms of PAR because there's a difference between facilitation, trained and certified and doing it well, being a chairman or a chairperson, and being a resource person. They all have different characteristics and duties. So I just throw that one in because sometimes we use these terms rather glibly without thinking of what they really mean. So at the bottom, you will see here really what the core of PAR is about in terms of looking at the cycle. So we're going to get to that pretty soon, and it looks like this. So since I can't walk about, I'm not going to give you the microphone. But you can see there the cycle, yeah. And there are a bunch of steps. I'm presuming this is familiar to many of you. Yes? You can nod. No? Okay. At least I see Terry nodding. But I would ask, if you have one of these diagrams, does anyone think that looks familiar to another cycle? And we're not just talking the regular old project cycle, dime a dozen. What does that remind you of? Anything? Yeah, policy cycle. Okay. Maybe that would be a good policy cycle. What else? I'm in agreement. Okay. Yeah, that too. There's another one that has become pretty popular in the literature. If this is a game show, I'll give you a lifeline. So the initials are AM. You're cheating. You're not supposed to say this, Chris. No. No hints. Huh? You heard her, didn't you? Yes. No, you didn't. Right, so adaptive management. The point here being is that PAR, like many other things, follows similar patterns. So it's not rocket science. It is science. It's transdisciplinary science, but it's not rocket science. So the important part that we'll come to is this bit here, where you follow, the usual stuff, but come you here, you are reflecting and you are learning. That is the really important part. If you're not doing that, you're not doing PAR, you're not doing adaptive management, you're not doing a lot of things well. So I'm not going to go through rote by rote each of these because all of you, I suspect, are quite familiar with them from the project cycle and from the many other synonyms, policy cycle and so forth that we go along. The main point would be is that whenever you're done co-developing and you're planning things and you're doing things and you're monitoring, hopefully participatory monitoring and evaluation, that's another huge topic, how to do that, is that you're going to have that reflection and you're going to have that learning to go around again and improve. So I'm not going to go through this, but the reference here by Kindon that you have goes through in quite a amount of detail what you would do at each of those steps. And again, none of it is rocket science, but at each point, you have tasks to do, you have tools with which to work, you have methods and approaches. Some of you may have already determined what your favorite tools and techniques are. But it's important to keep an open mind, obviously, as you probably will in your groups, to the ones that your colleagues use, what is coming out in the literature, and not necessarily go with fashion, but what you think really applies to that situation. And that's important. More of the same. And these steps, like I said, are pretty common, but it is not necessarily the labels on them, but it is how you implement them that is important. And we're going to go into some of that in more detail a little bit later. The same paper also makes the point that you have to have metrics. Many of you are of, I presume, so who's a fan of indicators? Who's an indicator person? Yeah, okay. You look very reluctant to admit that. Okay. But indicators and metrics are really important, yeah? But there's also this statement at the top. People like to say, particularly business and economist types and some of the quantitative types, you can't manage what you can't measure. But to me, you also can't measure what you don't understand. And a lot of what we're looking at is what we are understanding. And as Fikret said very modestly, as an old Turkish guy doing research for 60-odd years, he doesn't say that he is embedded and fully understands indigenous knowledge. He appreciates it. He hopes that he can faithfully represent it and communicate it, right? But the understanding is very important. So let's talk about how we have methods and techniques. Again, I'm presuming that several of you have favorites of what is shown on the screen here. And there's almost a place for everything in doing PAR. But of course, you have to be knowledgeable enough about the circumstances, the situation, to determine what is applicable when and with whom. So those are the decisions you need to make. And we're going to go through some of these, not all of these, in some later slides. But for example, let's just pick a few here. For the ethnographic types, they're deep into participant observation. Yeah, I would hope. For the more superficial type, interviewing and surveying will be cool. Mapping, we're going to cover mapping a little bit later, really important, particularly now you have Google Earth and you have drones and you have other things that can really enhance the quality of your mapping. My favorite, as I said, storytelling, diagram, exchange programs, an interesting one. So the fisheries guy, we're all into fisheries learning exchange. We call them FLEAs. Not a pleasant acronym, but we call them FLEAs. And if you read World Bank literature, they have a step-by-step guidance on how you can really design that. So again, more statements. Most of these you will already be familiar with in one way or the other, including the fact that there are many schools of PAR. And again, the reference by Kindon goes through a whole list of schools in different parts of the world, all of which have their favorite approaches and conceptual frameworks. Yeah? An important point is the one at the bottom here. And we'll return to this in several forms, is that there are levels of participation, as I'm sure many of you know, whether you're fans of Arnstein or some others. And you don't expect everyone to participate as deeply and in the same way on the same topics. Sometimes folks overlook that. And they think, well, everyone should be full tilt into participation. It doesn't happen. People will, as it says there, be on their own terms, whether that is limited by poverty, by interest, by learning, and I don't mean academic schooling, I mean just learning. That's important to bear in mind. Now, Chris mentioned power. Now, to many folks on the social side, especially of transdisciplinarity, power is the elephant in the room. There's been a lot of criticism that power is really just another way of shifting power around and really doesn't deal with the fact that there are asymmetries of power in most of the research that we do. Okay? So let's look at this a little bit deeper, because power is also one of the more difficult concepts to put a handle on and measure in the social sciences. You know, you're not like a natural scientist, so, oh, I see some power over there. What about the migratory patterns of power? And so forth. It has to be exercised, and how it is exercised depends on space, time, circumstance, and many things. Yesterday, Chris introduced a typology of power, but of course there are a dozen more. So the point would be that you need to understand the different modalities of power. And you also shouldn't assume that you're the most powerful person in the place, because your participants can totally upset your great research plans, particularly if they're not well co-developed with them. Yeah? They have power as well. And some of them are not afraid to exercise their power over you as the participant. Yeah? So it's bidirectional. But the point would be is that through the authority vested in you as the researcher, you have a duty, and we're going to deal a little bit about research ethics. You have a duty to keep an eye on power and the exercise of power, at least on your part. As you can see, there are many types there. And you may say, well, that's not me. I don't do that. Okay? Which is fair enough, but I'm just alerting you to have a deep bit of introspection there, because some of these things are subconscious. So the critiques of power have a lot to do with the negative use of power. And again, here's a list of statements, of examples. And you may say, oh dear, I'm not a power person, but gosh, I did that. So is it that you depict participants as saying, okay, well, they really need some research and development? I mean, that's what they need to get to the next level, to get through this hump, to overcome this problem. How much of that is an exercise of power on your part? Maybe they're just happy ignoring you and your perception of their condition. There are other things like making yourself basically the authority on participatory approaches. Maybe they have other means. Maybe researchers have gone before and they have favorites. Legitimizing elite local knowledge. So you're a local knowledge fan. Okay, you're an ILK person. Who is holding that? Are you saying that, okay, well, I talked to these folks and they really have the local knowledge? Well, obviously, you would have done your stakeholder analysis and maybe identified that you do have local elites, and maybe you should be looking at other folks as well. So the list goes on, and it is a matter of being constantly vigilant, yeah? Not necessarily going through the checklist, but being vigilant in your interactions. One way that power people have managed to turn the conceptual framing around is to say, well, power is often reflected in governance arrangements. Now, I'm a governance guy, so I was happy, when they did that, because that is a large part of what I do. And we had some of those key terms yesterday, like co-management and so forth, that were mentioned. I'm sure you're familiar with them, maybe even up close and personal. So the point would be is that if you're interested in power, obviously, you should be, look at the governance arrangements in whatever situation you are finding yourself doing your research. Do they reflect asymmetries in power? How? And so forth. Use the tools that you already know about. And the idea is that reforming governance, or at least understanding it, because it may not be in your position to reform anything that has to do with governance. It may be the context within which you're working, but to understand how that governance can be good. And one of my PhD students is looking at the difference between good governance, that normative stuff, whether you're World Bank or UN and you have your 8 principles or your 13 principles and you can tick them off and so forth. We have lots of books on that. There's also effective governance, which is not normative but empirical. What is it that you need out of those nice principles that will actually work on the ground in the situation you find yourself and that people will accept is good and wholesome and sufficient? They are satisficing, not necessarily optimizing or maximizing. They are satisficing, to use Lindblom, to determine what works for them as good governance. That's effective governance. And that is linked to the notion of empowerment, a term that folks bandy around fairly loosely for the most part. But again, that requires a fair amount of introspection as to who you're empowering, how, and what are the consequences of that. Which brings us to research ethics. Again, like I said, this is a tour de force of concepts and things that I'm sure you're familiar with, but it is how you connect them to make you a good power researcher and to make the beneficiaries, the participants, achieving what they want. Because remember, power is not so much about you as perhaps about them. Because if you're looking at advocacy, if you're looking at change, if they have an agenda, how does that relate to your research? And this also has to do with research ethics in many different ways. One of the ways is that you have to get ethics approval, presumably, from your university. So who's already gone through ethics board? To their staff. Oh, okay, yeah, fair amount. Was it fun? No. You were successful, yes, because yeah, you're here, so yeah, okay, that's good, okay. But IRB structures and ethics boards sometimes have rules that are unrealistic when you're doing this type of research. When, okay, you can say, okay, this is my list of 20 questions that they're going to approve with this sampling scheme, okay, and I'm going to make sure that they're anonymous and confidential. So you can get it approved, and you don't tell them, well, when I get to the field, actually all of that will change. Yeah? Because that is the reality. And the closer you are to that reality, sometimes the more uncomfortable it gets for your approval. And that can be a problem. So you have to determine your own ethics. Yeah? How much can you, provide a suitable facade? And we all play a game lots of games in universities. We all play a game to get things done by jumping through certain hoops, maybe going around some other obstacles and so forth. So we're good at that. But it depends on your ethics. The fact that you're dealing with someone else's problems as well, and it may change, is also related to ethics and how we approach action research. So I spent some time with some colleagues in the Pacific, where you have remote islands, of course, and they said that, because I'm wet and salty, dealing with marine protected areas or locally managed marine areas, they will say when they go into a place, and there are, again, maybe you need to deal with gatekeepers. So when you go into a location, even if you want to swim on a reef, you have a kava ceremony with the chief of the area, and there are things you do to get approved to even go swimming, go snorkeling, and explore the area. But there's also the fact that you need to see what their problems are. So you're interested in a nice managed area with all of the good features, but they want a road because transportation is an issue. So my Pacific colleagues use a one-program approach, which is common in other places, that if you go in, you don't parachute in, of course, you go in and embed yourself and know what's happening there. People may have other issues that they see you as being the solution to before they deal with what you consider to be your research priority, hopefully linked to them. So bear that in mind as well, because it has implications to ethics, it has implications for funding, it has implications for simply getting work done on the ground. But there are other sides. to it, which as researchers you may have encountered. Certainly in coastal places, you're dealing with sometimes some gunmen, some drug dealers, some illegal activities. How do you deal with that in your ethics, one for the board submission, but also in terms of dealing with folks on the ground? Mapping is a useful tool there, so okay, we can say, well, that is gunman territory. Illegal drugs are being landed there. You may be determining whether this is important or not for your research, but also whether it is important or not for their situation. Yeah? So you need to deal with that, but also for your own safety, determine how you're going to deal with folks who may test you, for example. So you figure, well, I go into this place, I'm embedded, and after a few months, they will tell me some of their secrets. But it is also quite common that after a couple of days, someone will tell you, well, actually, I have a patch of marijuana up in the forest there, and I'm making like 3 times the amount of money that I'm doing from fishing. And they look at you and they try and get your reaction. So what are you going to say? Oh, no, I'm not going to deal with marijuana. Or you're going to say, well, I can't write about that, but I'll ask you about it. Can I have a spliff or two and join you? So there are interaction issues dealing with ethics, but also your personal safety, what people confide in you. Now, I should check my time because part of my idea is that this kind of slide presentation thing is pretty all right, but really what we want to do is to discuss some stuff. So we're not going to do this now, but I'm going to give you a, yeah? Oh, I have 10 more minutes. You want 10 more minutes of me? Okay. We will see. So one of the exercises, there are 3 exercises, and because we are co-developing, you get to choose which exercises, if any, you want to do at the end. Or we can just talk about it, like I said. So taking from the Kindle paper, there are some things that are more, let us say, touchy-feely that you may like, given your very important introspection over the past couple of days. One is what are the key characteristics of PAR? So I won't spoil your adventure if you choose this exercise by going through this in detail, but we've mentioned several of them. So this is more of a summary, and I'm pretty sure that all of you, from your own experience, can add 3 or 4 more. So there are some instructions to this activity to have a look through and express yourself with colleagues about what you think are the most important characteristics of PAR. Bearing in mind we're still in that wide and woolly conceptual space. But here's another kicker. Since I've made all of these snide comments about you as researchers, what do you see in yourself or from your profiles as the key characteristics of yourselves or maybe others as PAR researchers? So this is an exercise that you may choose to do if you want to look at the big picture and your situation. It may help in your proposal to know your orientation, and this is one that is not supposed to reveal your secret stuff, but you're supposed to share with colleagues so that there's an understanding amongst the team, maybe where strengths are. I'm hoping they're all strengths and no weaknesses, but strengths can be different, yeah? And so that you can deploy these successfully in research, but also in your proposal. So let us continue on to the 2 other bits that will go quicker than that one. And again, I'm presuming that I'm going over ground that is very familiar to you. So when we're talking about CBM, and I'm wrapping citizen science in there. Now, there are distinctions, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm really not making those distinctions. Academics like to have disciplines and sub-disciplines and little tiny disciplines and children of disciplines. But we're talking about one functional bucket here. So community-based monitoring is in several flavors. My favorite flavor is participatory monitoring and evaluation, where it is not only going out and collecting stuff and information, maybe putting it in an Excel sheet and emailing it to someone, but also evaluating not only what the community, however that is construed, is doing. And usually it's a local community, it's site-based, yeah? But it also may be a network community, a community of interest, so folks may come in from different places. There is science tourism, for example, where you may have folks from over and away, particularly since some universities like to send shipments of students into far places, yeah, to help. We hope they help. Sometimes they don't. But there are many ways to configure community-based monitoring, but the participatory monitoring and evaluation, I think, is key. So here we have a definition of what the process is about from a bunch of authors here. It's not a bad definition, but of course, there are alternatives to that, yeah? So you may need to determine what it is you are envisaging. Now, we're presuming maybe that you are the researcher who wants to establish, as part of your action research, a community-based group for monitoring, whatever it is, yeah? But you may also come and find one already there in action, right? So you need to determine what the situation is. And this is something I know that Terry is going to deal with later. Environmental stewardship is at the core of CBM, yeah? The idea that whatever they're doing, even if they're doing it wrong, even if they're doing it badly, it should mean something to them in terms of framing themselves as stewards. So that is an important part of what we're looking at. The fact is that there's a whole bunch of variation in CBM. Most noticeably, to many people, is not only what they're monitoring, whether it is pH of water courses or whether it is some types of plants or animals or anything else, but also looking at who comprises the bunch and really what their aim is. If their aim is only to hand over data, or if they have an advocacy part of it. Now, that advocacy part could be of real interest in action research, as what are they advocating? What is the change that they're looking to make? And that you may be part of that research process to do. So there are a bunch of other statements here, but at the bottom here, it says there's a demand. So the demand, again, can be framed in many different ways. One of them is that, as you can see here, groups need to have some standards in monitoring. We're going to come to that a little bit later, maybe quite obvious to most of you. And the information needs to be used. You can have a lot of fun monitoring. We're going to come to that too. Monitoring can be really fun. It can be educational, but it may not lead to any decisions that make any difference. So you need to look at the full spectrum. So this leads us to the issues and challenges. A lot of them have to do with the decisions made, presumably by the group, however that group is constituted, and perhaps you're contributing to that, or maybe you're just a participant observer, or maybe you're just a detached scientist. Maybe you're the resource person for the group. So what is your role has to be taken into account in terms of your research, but also in terms of the interaction there. So, like I said, community groups have a lot of issues, and it depends on the situation. We won't go through those in detail. And this is one point that is quite common. Some folks need to say, well, we're monitoring because we want to know what's happening. Okay, that's a really good start, but it's not the end. Knowing what's happening needs to, in most cases, be framed into something. What does knowing, if you manage to measure the pH over time, even have a nice time series, what's the consequence of that? What are you observing that makes a difference? There may be lots of things that you're measuring and monitoring that make absolutely no difference to anybody. neither you nor the decision maker. But you like to go out with your buddies, drink some beers, park in a forest, stick your probes into a stream, and talk about it. And we're going to deal with that, because that is actually quite useful. So you need to have objectives, yeah? And be clear on the context. It's a matter of efficiency, unless you're really well funded as well, because otherwise you're wasting time and resources. And be able to make decisions. And we're going to talk about these networks a little bit more. So let's move on. I won't dwell upon this, but what you already know, and what I've already said, is that networks are really important, and that includes in CBM. Those networks ranging from the citizens to the decision maker, and often it's a matter of building social capital, a concept I'm sure you're all familiar with. Like I said, there are many different forms of CBM, so you can decide what label suits what you are observing. There are all types of frameworks and models and nice diagrams like this that set out how it should happen, which may not be how it does happen. So as scientists, you need to determine what really is, if you are a Weberian, ideal type, and compare to empirical evidence, okay? This is taken from a Canadian paper, as you may see from the authors. I did 2 of my degrees in Canada, so I kind of have an affinity to the place. And Canadians generally, they're pretty good folk. The thing to bear in mind is that whether you have a simple one like this or not, there is a set of steps and a framework to follow, yeah? And you may decide, as you will with PAR, what frame suits your purpose, okay? But this is pretty useful in terms of having some of the things that you already know about, so you can maybe relate to this easily. Identifying the stakeholders, not only the group monitoring, but the whole chain and network of decisions, skills and resources. What are people bringing to the process? What are you bringing to the process as the researcher, or the resource person, or the observer, or the evaluator? Whatever your role is, what do you bring? If you are a group itself, they should have a communication plan, because the whole idea is that you're monitoring for a purpose. It's not staying with the group. They often don't have the power to make decisions. And then, of course, there's the monitoring plan. We can look at this in more detail, and this is largely for you to recognize that all of this stuff you should be fairly familiar with, yes? So don't think about it as new, just think about how you assemble these parts for them to make sense, or how do you research these parts in a way that you can understand better what is happening. And there are some useful things here that you may not see in the academic literature, like identifying champions. So leadership is really important in a lot of PAR studies. Who are the leaders? Who are those who can lead networks? What networks do they lead? Are the networks modular in that you have a bunch of cliques and groups, or are they really diffuse? So network structure is really important. And of course, when you are monitoring, you need to have someone who can hopefully validate your results. Just don't send anything to the decision maker if you are indeed assisting the process. So let's just make some final points. Of course, there are a dozen more slides that could be put in there, and we can do this for 2 weeks. But the points that are here are pretty fundamental, and most of them we've gone over, and it's a matter of just reinforcing what you already know. And to my mind, the main thing is that because you are going to focus on participation and action, if you're looking at community-based monitoring, what are the key points and concepts that you need to include in your research framing? yeah? Depending on the role that you're taking. So that is CBM with citizen science. Well, let's talk about sargassum just for a few seconds. That is an area that is receiving some attention in terms of community-based monitoring and citizen science, not as much as we would wish in the Caribbean Sea, that larger region. But for example, you would have folks going out with smartphones who can determine and map the beaches where this seaweed is occurring, determine the species of seaweed. We have, if you go to CERMI's website, we have a whole set of information on how you can do simple monitoring, which is good for schools, which is good for citizens groups, and even university students are getting their MPhils out of it. So there is that guidance that can transcend the academic environment into citizen science, into education, and build capacity where there was perhaps less than before, yeah? So you can think about these things as you move ahead. So, let's do this time check here. I may be too optimistic about the 10 minutes. Okay, we're still good. We're going to deal a bit about SocMon. So in your pack, you would find these references. SocMon, some of you who are tree huggers may say, well, this says marine in it. That's not for me. But a point would be is that the flexibility of the approach is suitable for almost anything. And I would say, again, without saying any names, within this room, there are both Brazilian and Caribbean SocMon people. They have networks in both areas. You may determine who they are if you visit the website and see their names and ask them questions. Okay, right. So it is a technique that is in use in various places in the world. I won't give you the whole SocMon history, chapter and verse, but if you go to the website, you'll not only find case studies like this one from Brazil, but also a whole lot of other documents that may resonate with your particular interest in terms of doing a bit of action research that is site-based on the ground, whether in a coastal area or not. Very adaptive. And the techniques are very familiar, I think, to most of you. It's stuff you would have done in social methods somewhere or the other. Just stating the obvious, it is integrated monitoring, integrated in terms of the social components, but also integrated with ecology. In other words, when you are looking at the market orientation of stuff that people sell and capture, their harvest for their livelihoods, you've got to bear in mind the ecology. So it's not only about people, but people's interaction with nature, and what are we calling that? For me, social ecological systems thinking, yeah? Scaled down to site level, which is where SocMon resides. So I won't go through these steps the same way that I didn't go through the diagram for CBM or the cycle for PAR, because you can all find this online. I mean, and none of it is really revelational, except to include the learning. The reflection applies to everything we're talking about, the reflection and the learning. Up here, they use the word interdisciplinary, but I really think they're just afraid to say transdisciplinary. But you will find principles that would apply, hopefully, to what I said initially about PAR and what you are doing in your own research. So these steps that are here of looking at your team, conceptual models, questions, and they like questions and indicators, because surveys are a large part of this, and you can change variables as well. We're going to come to that. Communicating results, really, really important, similar to CBM, and so forth. So have a look if you're unfamiliar with the methodology. And like I said, You have different categories, different variables, as they're called, and you can develop new variables, fit them in to your own research. So you can add poverty, you can add gender, if this is important. You can add climate change. There are 10 more, or maybe you want to add 20 if climate change is of interest to you. So, highly adaptive. The point in the few remaining slides, and really there are a few, is that's all well and good, but the transdisciplinary bit, the bit that I enjoy the most, comes with the visualization techniques. Yeah? And often this is through group interviews and focus groups, there being a difference between these methods. And that is where you can have a lot of fun, and hopefully the participants as well, your co-researchers, in learning. Now, some of you are familiar with the Johari window. It has many different names. Familiar with that? No? Okay. So one of the things that you will do, first of all, is to determine if you have a 2x2 matrix, which is good for stakeholder analysis as well, which quadrant you're in. So you have, in terms of knowledge co-development, you have stuff that both you and the participants know, that you share. And that is really good for building trust and respect, that relationship you need to establish, yeah? But then there are 3 other quadrants as well. What you know and they don't know, that may be a chance to show off, but really it's a chance for you to assist in capacity building, if it is appropriate, but sharing insight of your view. There are very few places where people don't want to know what you think as the researcher. You got to share. Some people find it uncomfortable. The other quadrant is what they know that you don't. And that is where the ethics come in, is that you're not looking to extract their knowledge and simply cart it away, okay? But you need to find out that. And then there's the shared ignorance, the 4th quadrant, which is really the exciting bit. You don't know this stuff, they don't know that stuff, but together you can find it out. Visualization, in my view, is one of the more important tools for doing so. So, we won't dwell upon this. We know the power of imagery in whatever form it takes. I mean, really good with technology, what you can do with a smartphone or an iPad in the field in terms of images, even if it is photographs to get a conversation going. Yes? Whatever it takes, and also know that some people relate to some images more than others. For example, in a lot of the work we do, we use Google Maps, because people can say, oh, look, there's my house. I know that tree. Oh, look, there's a cow there. That's the neighbor's cow. They don't do that when they see a 2-dimensional ordnance survey map. They begin to wonder, what are these things I can't recognize? They're just names. They may even not be the local names, yeah? So you can use mapping, as we will see, to relate to their images. Some of these, I suspect, will be like no-brainers to most of you, maybe all of them. But in that big manual, we call it the big thick manual, the larger the 2 publications, there's a whole bunch of these techniques which you can do in a workshop type environment. You can do it on the beach, under a tree, in a forest, like I said, in a village. You don't need a wall. I do a lot of my work on the ground, because in most places there's actually ground you can work on. So whether you are putting your cards on the ground, putting rocks on the ground, whatever you are, you don't need that wall to work with. And people can walk around and get different perspectives. Now, facilitators and even felicitators know many of these tricks, and you should employ them if they're appropriate. So our resilience guy, where's our Resilience Alliance guy? Oh, he's right there. So resilience people want to know about perturbations. So one of the things, and I'm just going to go through these very quickly, is that timelines help you pick out perturbations, important things for anchoring imagery and talking about. To make it even more meaningful, you have historical transacts where you can have your different types of changes and talk about why changes occur, what direction they are, because in what we're doing, you don't necessarily want snapshots and static images. You want to know about trends, yeah? So you may not have your 10 years time series of measurements to put on your bar chart, but you can talk to people and find out what the trends are and what those trends mean. So that's one of the common tools. We've all talked about local knowledge, so that is good. And we're back to mapping, but this time, whether it is on the ground, whether it is building 3D models with clay and pieces of paper, whether it is sketching on that flip chart, getting to know people's view of things is important. In one study where we looked at, where other colleagues, not myself, looked at gentrification in a mangrove area, they asked the big up people with the $500,000 houses to map the area, which was used heavily for fishing. None of them included fishing in their maps. Why? It wasn't a matter of excluding them as a power, but it was cognitive dissonance. To them, they did not really see fishing in the area. So to them, it wasn't even a problem, something to be dealt with. It just simply was absent. So how people map areas can tell you a lot. This is looking at local knowledge and science. This is also from the coast of Nicaragua. You can do it properly or maybe not so properly, but there's a lot of information there in terms of knowledge co-development and sharing. Seasonal calendars are really critical in many cases. Whether you're just dealing with wet, dry season, whether you're dealing with seasons of fisheries, seasons in terms of people's livelihoods, looking at poverty trends or income trends on a household basis. All of these are things that I'm hoping that you all are familiar with and have your bag of tricks to do in the field with people, not necessarily in a workshop, in a classroom, but wherever you find people under a tree. Time use. One of these things that we use a lot in gender is to see how men and women have different uses of time, even different times of the year. And I will close with what we started with near the front, is to say a lot of this leads to being better at adaptive management, yeah? Which isn't just trying to think seat of the pants, but really looking at what the situation is, the framing, in order to improve on the next round. We have some activities here, if you want to look at these, if we have the time for them, including, well, the instructions you will see here. A lot of it is a matter of you working in pairs or teams, not necessarily your case study bunches, but so that you can talk to people, because that's really important. But looking at the models that we talk about and getting to know them a little bit, yeah? So all of these are in the handouts that you can access electronically, including the entire show. And I'm going to wrap up with this point, that there are many lessons maybe you have drawn from the presentation and a little bit of storytelling, not a lot on the side. And I'm sure that you can share more stories and more insight about how you get that transformative transdisciplinarity woven into your research, because that will be your challenge for the remainder of the course. So hopefully you've gained some insight into this, remembering that we're only dealing with the tip of the iceberg and there's a lot more to cover. Thanks for everyone.